Good evening. This is your barkeeper speaking. Glad you could join us for tonight's show. Think you're gonna like it. And don't forget to lock that door on your way out.
Lakea, the librarian, has a few stories she's collected and would like to share tonight. She says she hopes you enjoy them as much as she did making them for you.
Black Dog or Dogman. As a truck driver for many years, I have heard tons of stories about truckers seeing the infamous Black Dog. Supposedly one of the more well-known ones is when a trucker has been awake for a long number of hours straight and sees a black dog running straight towards their rig. It is said that when the black dog appears, it is an omen of death usually. Many truckers have had accidents due to swerving away from the black dog and ultimately crashing. One evening, early on in my career, I was driving through a stretch of highway in Arizona. I had been driving for around a total of 8 hours. Minus the occasional restroom break every few hours or so, I was new to the job and my body and sleeping habits had yet to become adjusted to sitting for so long, driving and staying awake for extended hours at a time. So I tried to take several breaks so I could stretch my legs and walk around for a few minutes to make myself wake up and become more alert. It had been a while since I had taken my last break at a truck stop. I was starting to feel myself getting tired, so I grabbed a candy bar out of my bag that was sitting in the passenger seat. Because it was nighttime, I was hoping the sugar rush would work to give me enough steam to make it to my next location. The stretch of highway that I was traveling on was pretty bare, and I had not seen any other vehicles in quite a while. I drove a bit further, all the while still waiting for the sugar rush to kick in, when I had decided to turn on the radio. I thought to myself that maybe singing along to some songs might keep me awake. That worked for a while. As I was belting out a very popular rock ballad of the time, I noticed something running along the side of the road in the same direction my truck was heading. I could only make out the top of its head and ears over the front right corner of my hood. It appeared to be dark in color with ears shaped like a Doberman's. I glanced back at the road in front of me, still no vehicles in the oncoming lane, and when I looked over the corner of the hood, the animal was gone. I drove about another quarter of a mile, when in my own lane, being illuminated by my headlights, was a huge black creature on all fours. As soon as my eyes locked with the creature's, it began to run straight towards my truck. I immediately jerked my foot off the gas pedal and mashed down the clutch and brake. I gripped the steering wheel with what seemed like a death grip. I held my breath, fearing that this was it. I had just been marked by the infamous black dog for death. Then the next thing I knew, I heard a huge thud, and looking at me eye to eye, only a few feet apart, was this hugely massive canine dog-looking creature. As my rig was beginning to slide on the pavement, this creature was growling and snapping its insanely large jaws right at my windshield. It was the biggest dog-like animal I have ever seen. The color of it was as black as the nighttime sky. It had short black hair all over its body, with only sparse patches of hair on its snout. Its muscles went on for days. Think of the most well-defined bodybuilder you have ever seen. Now place that bodybuilder on the most insane steroids times 10. That is the only way I know how to even start by describing the muscles on that canine creature I seen. The eyes on the creature seemed to glow on their own, making them look almost otherworldly. But I knew this animal was real and not something of a myth or being, supernatural, because it was slinging white foam that had been dripping from its mouth all over my hood and windshield. I could hear my hood popping and bowing from the canine's weight, even over the music on the radio. The truck began to jackknife towards the right shoulder of the road. I was terrified of crashing. terrified of this creature on my hood, ready to bite my head off, it seemed. I closed my eyes and started to pray. I think I was still holding my breath at this point because I started to feel lightheaded. After what seemed like an eternity, my truck finally came to a halt. The black canine creature was still on the hood and had started to pound the windshield with its head. I unbuckled my seatbelt and dove into the passenger floorboard. I laid there huddled into the tiniest ball I could make myself into, while the animal kept pounding the windshield and making the hood pop under the stress of all of its weight. I am not sure how long that went on, but after all the noise finally stopped, I reached my arm over and turned off the truck so I could hear what was going on outside better. There was only silence after that, minus the heavy breathing coming from my own mouth and nose. I stayed curled up in that floorboard until the next morning, when I heard a vehicle approaching. I slowly raised my head up and looked out the window. The car approached the spot where my truck was jackknifed, half on, half off the shoulder of the road. When the car came to a stop, a man got out and approached my truck. I climbed up and completely out of the floorboard and began to exit the truck through the passenger side door. As I started to take a step out of the cab of the truck, I looked over my left shoulder, through the windshield, out at the hood of my truck. It was covered in dents. If I had not have been there when it had happened, I would swear that the truck had been in one hell of a hailstorm, because the dents were so bad. The couple in the car were nice enough to let me catch a ride with them to the nearest store, where I used the phone to call my boss. I tried to tell him what happened, but he wasn't having any of it. He chalked everything up to me being a new driver and pulling long hours. After that, I was assigned to be part of a driving team, which lasted for several years. I have tried to tell my incident to several people, but I always get the same reaction. They all think I am crazy, but I know better than that. I know what I've seen, and I have seen what just it jumping on the hood of an 18-wheeler can do. I don't even want to think about what it could have done to me. Mistaken identity. My grandmother's name was June. She passed away a couple of years ago. I was just browsing the web one night out of boredom and came across something called a Dogman. I read several posts about it and thought it was odd enough, so I mentioned it to my husband. He sat still for a few minutes before he told me about the night that I was at work and my grandmother June had called him. My husband said that it was around 9 p.m. when the phone rang. He said my grandmother told him she had been cleaning her kitchen and had just tied up the garbage bag and was taking it out back to the garbage can. She said as she placed the garbage bag inside the garbage can and closed the lid, she heard a slurping noise to her left by the corner of the house. She then told my husband that she thought she had forgotten to turn the water hose off earlier that day from watering her tomato plants, so she grabbed up the bottom hem of her long house coat and set off around the corner of the house. When she turned around the corner, at first glance, she thought the neighbor's dog down the road had caught an orphaned fawn in her yard, because she could see the baby deer's head clearly from the yard light. But when what she thought was the neighbor's dog turned around, she told my husband she thought she had just seen a werewolf. Grandmother June said this dog turned around and looked at her while baring its teeth at her. She then told my husband this thing stood up on two of its hind back legs and took a step towards her. That's when she said she took off running into the house and locked the door and called my husband. My husband said that at first he didn't believe her because the part where it stood up on its hind legs like a human would sounded too far-fetched, so he asked her if she had taken her nightly meds, told her to get some sleep and that he would drop by the next morning to check on her, since I would be sleeping because I work night shift at my job. He told me the next morning that he did stop by her house. There was a baby deer carcass there with the middle ripped out, and blood and what he assumed were dog tracks around the spot where the carcass laid. He said he removed the carcass and disposed of it, then he washed her ground with the water hose, so June wouldn't have to see the mess. He said when he went inside, he tried to reason with her about what she thought she saw, and what more than likely actually happened. My husband said that my grandmother wasn't having any of it, though. and she kept swearing that she had seen a werewolf. And until I myself told him about these dogman creatures I read about online, he just thought it was one of the neighbor's dogs or even a coyote. But now, after what I have researched and what my grandmother had told him, neither of us are so sure anymore. I wonder if my grandmother really did see one of those dogman things. Sighting at the river. My name is Thomas, and I think that my story might be of interest to you. One day, a couple of summers ago, myself and my 17-year-old son Brad were fishing on the banks of a river in Arkansas. The day started off normal, like all of our other fishing days had. We had left out early that morning from the house with our food and gear in tow. It was about an hour's drive from the house before we reached our fishing spot destination. We grabbed our lunch bags, rods, and tackle boxes and headed down the small trail to our favorite fishing spot on the riverbank. When we finally got to our spot, we took about 30 minutes to set our stuff down and get everything ready so we could fish. We fished for several hours, all the while having some father-son small talk and cracking jokes at one another's expense. Brad had caught 2 fish by then to my 0, and since lunchtime was approaching, I suggested we should take a break from fishing to enjoy our sandwiches and chips. We ate our lunches in the shade of some trees so that we could cool off from the hot blazing summer sun. Everything was still going as normal as it always did. After that lunch is when things took a turn for the strange and unusual category. We had continued fishing for about another hour or so when my son Brad suddenly stopped in the middle of his sentence, explaining to me why he was choosing one college over another to attend the next fall. I looked over at him thinking that boy had just landed himself his 3rd fish now to my 0. But that was not the case. He was staring at something straight across from him on the bank of the other side of the river. So I turned to look at what he was staring at and gasped. At first I thought I was looking at possibly a black bear. But then to my utter horror I realized this animal was no ordinary bear, but some type of strange, muscular dog that I had never seen before. But yet, at the same time, it didn't look exactly like a dog either. It wasn't until this dog walked completely out of the woodline on the other riverbank and by an old log that had been laying there forever that then I realized just how big that animal really was. And let me tell you, it was huge. Myself and Brad stood very still, rods in hand, as the animal walked on 4 legs down to the edge of the river. It stood there for a few minutes just watching us before lowering its head down to the water to drink, never taking its eyes off of us. I then whispered to my son to start slowly walking back over to me, thinking we would both then slowly and quietly back away and call it a day. As Brad took 1 step backwards, the animal jerked its head up. I then told Brad not to move. The beast, which is how Brad and myself refer to it now, took 1 more drink from the river before raising back up and turning back to the woodline. Then instead of walking back into the woods on all 4s like it had when it had walked out, we then heard what I can only describe as a popping noise, even over the rush of the water, before the beast stood up on its back legs and walked back into the woods. A few seconds later, after it had returned to the woods, we then heard the most terrifying howl come from that side of the riverbank where the animal had entered the woods. The howl seemed to go on forever, or at least that is how it seemed to the 2 of us at the time. When the howl finally stopped, we immediately grabbed our gear and raced back to the truck. Now, I have to say that I have lived in that area all of my life. I have heard many tales on the strange and unusual. I am also used to the local animals and wildlife in the surrounding areas. But I have never seen nor heard of anything like what I and my son witnessed that day. We both refused to fish in that area anymore, and we both have vowed never to go back there either. For the times that we have fished since then, in different locations, we are both very more aware of our surroundings, and we never go alone. Acorn Attack. In 1962, myself and some of my schoolmates had been playing at the local park and playground on our street. We all were around 8 years old at the time, and I can remember it being summer because we were all barefooted. The playground was at the end of our cul-de-sac. Behind the playground was a fence that separated us kids from the woods. All of us boys had been running around playing tag when my friend Barry got hit. He got mad and yelled at the rest of us, thinking one of us had picked up a rock and threw it at him. I walked over to him, telling him that it wasn't me. As I was standing there, something then hit me. I looked down between my feet, and there was an acorn. The other boys by this time had gathered around me and Barry. We were all standing there blaming each other when 3 more friends were hit by acorns. Now all 8 of us were huddled together, acorns all over the ground around us, looking to see who was throwing things at us. After looking in all directions, trying to find the culprit but seeing no one, we went back to arguing. The next thing we knew, we were being pelted by acorns. Our bodies were covered in huge red whelps at this point. Then Barry hollered, "Look!" We all stopped and turned to where my friend Barry was pointing. There at the back of the playground, behind the 6-foot wooden fence, stood a huge, brown, hairy beast. We all froze on sight. It stood there just staring back at us. The fence only reached it about chest high. Behind us, we heard a car turning around in the cul-de-sac. We all looked, thinking that it was one of our parents telling us it was time to come home. When we turned back around, the beast was gone. All 8 of us quickly gathered our bikes and raced home. It was a long while before any of us played back at the playground, but we did spend many a day talking about what we had seen. I know I, for one, will never forget.